Bonjour, French 1. Today is a momentous day in your French 1 careers because you learn about the boot. As in, there is a way of memorizing certain verb forms known as the boot. I don't know if French people know about this, but I know that English speakers that are learning French often use the boot as a way of memorizing some verb forms. And today I have to tell you that, the last time I told you about ER verbs where with GER and CER verbs there's an exception in the news form, and I told you I lied. Ladies and gentlemen, I lied again. There is another exception to ER verbs. Now this is the last one we're going to learn this year, so don't get too terribly mad at me. But there's another exception that we need to talk about today. So before we do that, real quick, don't write this down, just kind of take a look at the screen. I want to remind you what your ER verb endings are, because the endings are the same. That's not what's different this time. So again, when you have an ER verb, which is like préférer, you know it's an ER verb because it ends in the letters ER in that order. And when you have an ER verb, the way you conjugate it or change the ending on it so that you're not saying something like I prefers ice cream to cake and instead say I prefer ice cream to cake, is that you have to drop off your ER and you have to add certain endings based on the subject. And those endings again are the ones that go along with that very cheesy song of S, S, O-N-S, O-N-S, O-Z, 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 O-N-T. Ente. So that has not changed. That's what we've known so far. But there are some different exceptions that occur not with the letters, like with the GER and CER, but with the accent marks. So the first kind of exception is happens with the verb préférer and two other verbs that are like it. The verbs espérer, which is to hope, and répéter, which are to repeat. These are verbs that already have an accent mark over the first or second E in this case. And they all kind of work the same, and there's just a tiny spelling difference, and that exception is that the accent mark is flipped on certain forms and the second E. So you see how right now both of the accent marks are going the same direction. They're both going this way, right? The second one here on the second E is going to flip the other direction on certain forms. Now, rather than just listing the forms, because there's 4 of them, I'd be listing the je form, the tu form, the il form, and the ils form. The way we remember which forms have the irregularity is the boot. If you'll notice, there is a very ugly boot drawn on your screen. It encompasses the je form, the tu form, the il form, and the ils and els form. See, like this would be where your toes are at, and this is where the laces are. I know it's ugly and it's hard to picture. Basically, it's leaving out the nous and the vous form. The reason why we want to leave out the nous and the vous form is because they're not part of this exception. So the nous and the vous form of préférer actually look the exact same way that you would have done them way back in September when we first learned ER verbs. You drop off the ER, oh, by the way, préférer is to prefer. You drop off the ER and you add the ONS ending for nous, the EZ ending for vous, and nothing else changes. Accent marks are still going in the same direction. It's everything you could have done months and months and months ago. But the reason why we have to talk about this today is because the 4 forms that are inside the boot have that second accent mark flipped. So when I start to show you these, you'll notice I've highlighted them because it's kind of hard to see the accent marks on the screen. The second accent mark over the second E here is flipped the other direction. It almost makes a little house around the F because the first E has an accent mark going this direction and the second E has an accent mark going down and to the right, this direction. And again, that happens for all of the forms that are inside the boot. It has to do with French pronunciation and things that we don't necessarily need to get into and bore you with right now, but the bottom line is the verbs préférer, espérer, and répéter, which all have an accent mark on their second E. Some of them also have it on the first E. Whenever you go to conjugate that verb in all of its forms, you drop off the ER, you add the ending like you always did, but then on those inside the boot forms, you have to flip the accent mark to the other direction on the second E. Random and strange and hard to remember, I know, but we're going to be focusing on verbs like that or like this in this section. Mostly because you tend to use the verb prefer whenever you talk about whether you prefer the yellow backpack or the green backpack. So once you've done that, you end up with je préfère, which is I prefer, tu préfères, you prefer, il or elle or on préfère, which is he or she or we prefer. For we prefer, it's nous préférons. For y'all prefer, it's vous préférez. And for they prefer, it's actually either ils or elles préfèrent. Now, the other kind of verb that this happens with are verbs like acheter. Now, acheter is the verb for to buy. We've learned it a while back, and again, the reason why it comes up in this section is because you talk about buying the yellow or the green backpack. We're talking about shopping a little bit. There are 4 other verbs that'll follow this same irregularity as acheter, and those are amener, which is to bring someone along, emmener, which is to take somebody along, same kind of idea, no big deal. Lever, which is to raise, like how you can raise your hand or you can raise yourself up and stand up, and promenade, which is to take a walk. All of these verbs look like seemingly normal ER verbs that you would have had no trouble doing back in September. And if you had done them in September and you had dropped off the ER and added the same endings, you would have been very close to having all of them right. But again, we have this ugly looking boot thing on your screen. That's because the inside the boot forms have a little exception, and that is that the first E actually gets an accent mark on those two. So let's backtrack here for a second. News form, booze form, nothing different than what you've always learned. News form, you drop the ER, add an ONS, you get we buy or we are buying, which is nous achetons. For the vous form, you drop off the ER, you add the EZ, you get vous achetez, which is y'all are buying or y'all buy. But with the ones that are inside the boot, they are the reasons why we even have to have this video today and why we have to practice this. There is a slight exception, and that is that where there has never been an accent mark before, you actually have to add one in. So it goes over the first E on all of these. So whereas the previous page, I'm going to switch back here for a second, it was all about the second E, and it was about flipping an accent mark that was already there on the inside the boot forms. On this one, it's about the first E that you find in your phrase there, except with amener, there is one little difference there. But it's about the first E that you find, and it's about making it actually have an accent mark where it didn't have one before. So you drop the ER, you add your letter E with the je form, and then you have to remember to go back and add an accent. It's called an accent grave. It goes down and to the right over the first E there. For I buy or I am buying, and that is j'achète. For the to form, you drop your ER, you add your ES just like you've always done. Don't forget to add that accent mark because it's inside the boot, and you get tu achètes for you buy or you're buying. For the il, elle, on form, for the he and she form, you drop the ER, you add the letter E like you've always done, but don't forget to add that accent mark over the first E because it's inside the boot. Il achète or elle achète. And same thing with ils and elles. Drop the ER, add your ENT ending over here, but don't forget also to add that accent mark because it's inside the boot. Again, that would be ils or elles achètent. For they buy or they are buying. I know these seem very random and very specific and very unnecessary for us English speakers who don't care that much about accent marks. But for the French, it's about spelling the word correctly, and it really has to come down to that French pronunciation that's a little bit different than ours. So do your best to remember and do your best to keep track of these exceptions and pat yourself on the back because now you are a part of an exclusive club of people that knows what it means to have a boot verb as a memorization technique.